The morning light rested carefully across a New York studio apartment, as if afraid to disturb perfection. On a nearby desk, Lisa Fonssagrives seemed to linger in the air, a trace of discipline, a shadow of geometry. The photograph beside her, Lisa with veil, caught the same poise she had carried through a lifetime of stillness. Irving Penn's handwriting beneath it read, "The first and the last light." When the city finally learned she was gone, it felt less like death than the closing of a perfect pose, measured, quiet, absolute. February 4th, 1992. New York City. The fashion world learned of her death through quiet channels. No dramatic announcement, no front-page headlines, just the news passing through studios and agencies that the woman who defined what it meant to be a fashion model had died peacefully in her sleep. Lisa Birgitta Bernstone Fonssagrives Penn, the name alone a history of marriages and reinventions, Swedish origins and French sophistication and American success, was gone. She was 80 years old. Irving Penn, her husband of 42 years, said nothing publicly. He simply stopped photographing for weeks, his studio dark, his cameras silent, as if acknowledging that without Lisa, light itself had lost its purpose. The obituaries tried to capture her significance. First supermodel dies at 80. Lisa Fonssagrives, fashion icon, dead. They listed her achievements, hundreds of magazine covers, highest-paid model of the 1940s and 1950s, muse to every great photographer of her era. But the statistics couldn't convey what Lisa had actually done, which was to transform modeling from a job into an art form to prove that a woman standing still could be as expressive as a dancer in motion. That elegance was not something you wore, but something you embodied. She turned stillness into choreography and posture into prayer. But here's what haunts everyone who examines Lisa Fonssagrives' life and death. She died at exactly the right time, having lived long enough to see her influence become ubiquitous, but not so long that she had to watch herself become irrelevant. She'd retired from modeling in her 40s, early by today's standards, but revolutionary for her era, and spent the next 4 decades working quietly as a sculptor and photographer, creating art rather than being art, shaping clay rather than being shaped by cameras. She'd understood something most models never learn, that you can't be a muse forever, but you can be an artist for life. Was Lisa's death really just the natural conclusion of a long, accomplished life? Or does it reveal something about women who build careers on being looked at, who understand that visibility has an expiration date, who plan their exits as carefully as their entrances? But to understand how a Swedish ballet dancer became the most photographed woman of the 1940s, how Lisa Fonssagrives taught fashion what modeling could be, we must go back. Back before New York, before Penn, before the hundreds of magazine covers. Back to Gothenburg, to dance, to the discipline that would define everything that followed. Lisa Birgitta Bernstone was born on May 17, 1911 in Gothenburg, Sweden, into a comfortable middle-class family that valued education and culture but had no connection to fashion or modeling. Her childhood was ordinary, unremarkable. She was pretty but not extraordinarily so. Intelligent but not prodigious, interested in movement and dance in the way many girls are without it necessarily leading to careers. What set Lisa apart wasn't talent or beauty but discipline. She understood from a young age that achievement required work, that grace was earned rather than given, that anything worth doing required complete commitment. She began studying ballet as a teenager, not in Stockholm but in Paris, having somehow convinced her parents that serious dance training required leaving Sweden for the cultural capital of Europe. In 1930s Paris, she studied under teachers who'd worked with Diaghilev's ballet Russes, who understood that ballet wasn't just entertainment but an art form as demanding as painting or sculpture. Lisa learned the discipline of daily practice, the requirement of perfecting movements until they became instinct, the understanding that your body was both your instrument and your artwork. The ballet studio became her church. Every morning before dawn, Lisa would arrive at the practice room, a drafty space with cracked mirrors and a piano that was always slightly out of tune, and begin the ritual of warming up. The bar exercises weren't just physical preparation, but a form of meditation, each plie and tendu a prayer to the gods of precision and control. She watched the older dancers, the ones who danced with the great companies, and saw in their bodies the accumulation of decades of discipline. The turned-out feet that could no longer walk normally. The backs held so rigidly straight they seemed incapable of relaxation. The faces that had learned to smile through pain until the smile became permanent. Ballet taught Lisa that beauty was inseparable from suffering, that grace required the willingness to destroy your body in service of an ideal. She learned to dance on bleeding feet, to hold positions until her muscles screamed, to repeat movements hundreds of times until they became automatic. But more importantly, she learned that the audience should never see this suffering, that the purpose of all that discipline was to make difficulty look effortless, to transform work into something that appeared weightless and natural. This understanding that true elegance meant hiding all evidence of effort would become the foundation of her modeling career. Her teachers recognized something unusual in Lisa. Not the most talented dancer, not the most naturally flexible or graceful, but the most willing to work, to endure, to approach ballet as a kind of religion where perfection was the distant god you worshipped through daily practice. "You dance like someone building a cathedral," one teacher told her, "one stone at a time, with absolute faith that the structure will eventually reveal itself." It was both compliment and criticism. Lisa's dancing was more architectural than musical, more about form than feeling. But in that architectural quality lay something powerful and original. But Lisa was realistic enough to understand that she'd started too late to become a prima ballerina, that the girls who danced at the Paris Opera had been training since childhood, that her future lay somewhere else. What she'd gained from ballet, though, was more valuable than a dancing career. She'd learned to hold positions that hurt, to make difficulty look effortless, to understand her body in space, to translate emotion into physical form. These skills, seemingly useless outside of dance, would make her the greatest model of her generation. The transition to modeling happened organically, almost accidentally. Lisa needed money. Dance training didn't pay and her family's support was limited. And someone suggested she try modeling. Not runway modeling, which barely existed in the 1930s, but photographic modeling for fashion magazines and advertising. Lisa, practical and unsentimental about her appearance, agreed. She understood immediately that modeling was just another form of performance, another way of using her body to create images, another discipline requiring practice and precision. "Modeling was my ballet," she would later say. "The studio was my stage." Could anyone have predicted that this Swedish dance student who'd turned to modeling out of financial necessity would revolutionize fashion photography, would become the standard against which all future models would be measured? The photographer who discovered Lisa's potential was Willie Maywald, who saw in her something beyond conventional beauty. An intelligence about angles, an instinct for light, a dancer's awareness of line and form. He introduced her to other photographers, and word spread through Paris's tight-knit fashion community. There was a Swedish girl who understood what photographers needed before they asked, who could hold positions perfectly, who brought training and discipline to work that most models approached casually. Horst P. Horst photographed her and said later, "She stood still like the light had found exactly the body it needed." It was accurate. Lisa didn't just pose. She became architecture, her body forming shapes that satisfied some deep aesthetic need for balance and proportion. She measured emotion the way others measured light, precisely without excess. She wasn't the prettiest model or the most charming, but she was the most professional, the most reliable, the one who could deliver what photographers envisioned without drama or difficulty. By the late 1930s, Lisa was working constantly. Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, every publication that mattered. She'd married a photographer, Fernand Fonssagrives, and taken his name, becoming Lisa Fonssagrives. The marriage wouldn't last. Few marriages survive when both partners are artists competing for the same space. But the name stuck. And it was as Lisa Fonssagrives that she became famous, that she appeared on hundreds of magazine covers, that she defined 1940s elegance. What made Lisa different from other models? It wasn't beauty. There were more conventionally beautiful women. It wasn't youth. She was in her 30s and 40s during her peak years, ancient by modeling standards even then. It was precision. Lisa approached modeling like an engineer approaches a bridge, every angle calculated, every movement intentional, nothing accidental or casual. "I was a dancer who modeled," she explained, "not a model who posed." The distinction mattered. Dancers understand that beauty comes from discipline, that form follows function, that the audience should never see the work required to make something look effortless. Behind all that precision and control, was there a warmth, a passion that cameras couldn't capture? Those who knew Lisa say yes and no. She was warm with people she trusted, but formal with everyone else. Passionate about her work, but unsentimental about her appearance. Capable of intimacy, but protective of her privacy. She'd learned from ballet that maintaining the illusion required hiding the effort, that audiences didn't want to see sweat or struggle, that mystery was part of performance. The 1940s were Lisa's decade. She was everywhere. Magazine covers, advertising campaigns, editorial spreads. She became the highest-paid model in the world, earning sums that seem modest now but were unprecedented for the time. But more importantly, she was setting standards. Before her, models showed clothes. After her, they showed control. Lisa proved that models could have long careers, that you didn't have to be 20 to work in fashion, that professionalism mattered as much as appearance. Vogue wrote, "Lisa Fonssagrives doesn't wear fashion, she becomes it." Her most famous collaborators understood what made her special. Man Ray photographed her in surrealist compositions where her body became sculpture, abstract form, rather than human figure. He said she was the only model who understood that fashion photography was art disguised as commerce. Erwin Blumenfeld created the iconic 1939 image of Lisa on the Eiffel Tower, perched impossibly on a steel beam 300 feet up, dress billowing, smiling as if standing on solid ground rather than empty air. The photograph became legendary, an image of fearlessness and grace that seemed to define Lisa's approach to everything. Do the impossible, make it look easy, smile through the terror. Working with Man Ray was like dancing with a surrealist philosopher. He saw Lisa not as a woman, but as a problem in geometry, a form to be manipulated and abstracted until it revealed some hidden truth about beauty or desire or the relationship between object and observer. In his studio, Lisa would hold positions for hours while he experimented with lighting and multiple exposures, creating images where her body multiplied or dissolved or merged with objects until she became something other than human. She found the work fascinating. This transformation from person into symbol, this proof that the camera could lie beautifully and reveal truths through those lies. Horst P. Horst approached photography differently. He was interested in Lisa as architecture, in the way her dancer's training allowed her to create lines and angles that satisfied his classical aesthetic sense. His photographs of her are studies in balance and proportion, each image carefully composed so that Lisa's body forms part of a larger geometric pattern. He would position her against columns or staircases, using her as a living element in compositions that referenced Greek temples and Renaissance paintings. She understood, Horst said, that her body was never the subject. It was the medium through which light expressed itself. With Avedon, the dynamic was different again. He was younger than the other photographers Lisa worked with, hungrier, more interested in movement and energy than in static perfection. He pushed Lisa to move during shoots, to walk or turn or gesture, capturing her in motion rather than stillness. At first she resisted. Her training was in holding positions, not breaking them. But gradually she understood that Avedon was asking her to bring her ballet training more fully into photography, to think of modeling not as a series of frozen poses, but as a kind of choreography where each moment flowed into the next. Their collaboration produced some of fashion photography's most dynamic images. Lisa mid-stride, her dress catching air, her face expressing something more alive and immediate than the usual model's mask. Richard Avedon photographed her and said, "Lisa didn't pose, she levitated." It was hyperbole but captured something true. Lisa seemed to defy gravity, to occupy space without weight, to exist in photographs as pure form rather than physical body. Cecil Beaton called her silence made visible, recognizing that Lisa's power came partly from what she didn't do, from her refusal to charm or seduce or demand attention, from her willingness to be a canvas rather than the painting. But it was Irving Penn who truly understood her, who saw not just a model but an artist, a collaborator, eventually a wife. They met in the late 1940s when Penn was already establishing himself as one of fashion photography's most innovative voices. Someone who approached each image as a formal problem to solve rather than just pretty pictures to make. Lisa was in her late 30s, old for a model, but Penn didn't care about age. He cared about form, about geometry, about the discipline required to hold a position while he worked out lighting and composition. Their working relationship was immediate and profound. Penn would position Lisa in his studio, often against his signature plain backgrounds, eliminating distractions, making the photograph about nothing but body and fabric and light. And she would hold whatever position he needed, as long as he needed, without complaint or drama. Every photograph he took of Lisa was a negotiation between worship and precision. Penn said later, acknowledging that professional admiration had become something deeper, that in photographing her he was also learning to love her. They married in 1950, a union of two artists who understood each other's work completely, who spoke the same visual language, who both believed that fashion photography could be art if approached with enough seriousness and skill. The marriage would last until Lisa's death, 42 years, unusual in any industry, but especially in fashion and photography where relationships tend to be brief and turbulent. They had a son, Tom, who would become a metal designer, carrying forward the family's dedication to making beautiful, functional objects. The marriage between Lisa and Irving Penn was, by all accounts, a study in complementary opposites. Penn was meticulous to the point of obsession, spending hours perfecting lighting setups, shooting hundreds of frames to get one perfect image. Lisa brought a different kind of precision, the dancer's ability to find the exact position and hold it perfectly while Penn worked. In their studio, a kind of silent communication developed. Penn would gesture vaguely toward a position he wanted, and Lisa would interpret that gesture, offering her body as a solution to his visual problem. Sometimes they would work for hours without speaking, the only sounds the click of the camera and the rustle of fabric as Lisa adjusted her pose. But their relationship wasn't just professional collaboration. At home, away from cameras, they were deeply domestic, cooking together, gardening, raising their son in a household where art and ordinary life were inseparable. Penn would photograph Lisa doing everyday tasks, arranging flowers, reading, simply sitting in natural light. These photographs, rarely published during her lifetime, show a different Lisa than the fashion icon, more relaxed, more human, still beautiful, but in a way that acknowledged the passage of time and the reality of aging. Penn loved this Lisa as much as or more than the model. understanding that the woman was more interesting than the image, that real life was richer than any photograph could capture. Lisa, for her part, found in Penn something she'd never had with her first husband, Fernand. True creative partnership without competition. Fernand had been threatened by her success, uncomfortable that she was more famous than he was, more in demand. Penn had his own reputation and didn't need to borrow from hers. He was secure enough to acknowledge her contribution to their photographs, understanding that his images of Lisa worked because of her intelligence and training, not despite it. "You only need one great photographer," Lisa wrote to Penn in 1960, "the one who loves you." It was both romantic declaration and professional assessment. She'd found the photographer who could see her completely, both as model and as woman, and that seeing was a kind of love. After marrying Penn, Lisa continued modeling, but increasingly only for him, becoming his exclusive muse in ways that limited her commercial work but deepened their artistic collaboration. Penn created some of his most iconic images using Lisa, the 1950 photograph of her in a Balenciaga dress standing with impossible elegance. The series of images where her face is obscured by veils or shadows, making her anonymous, turning her into pure form. The portraits where she's not modeling fashion but simply existing in front of his camera, allowing herself to be documented rather than styled. But Lisa understood that modeling had an expiration date, that you couldn't be a muse forever, that she needed to plan for a future beyond being photographed. In her early 40s, still beautiful, still in demand, still capable of working, she began gradually retiring from modeling. Not dramatically, not with announcements or farewell campaigns, but simply by accepting fewer assignments, appearing less frequently, redirecting her energy toward work that would sustain her when the cameras stopped. She'd always been interested in sculpture, in working with three-dimensional form rather than two-dimensional images. After decades of being shaped by light, she began shaping light itself through clay. Now she began seriously studying it, working with clay and wire, creating figures that showed her understanding of the body as sculptural object, the same understanding that had made her such an effective model. "I'm sculpting now the way I sculpted myself for cameras," she explained, "but now I control the final form." The transition from being sculptured to sculpting was more profound than it might appear. For 3 decades, Lisa had been object, beautiful, controlled, perfectly positioned, but still fundamentally passive, waiting for the photographer to release the shutter, depending on someone else's vision to give her form meaning. Now, working with clay in the small studio Penn set up for her, she was finally subject, the one making decisions about form and line and balance. Her hands, which had spent decades holding poses, now shaped clay, finding in the physical manipulation of material a satisfaction photography had never provided. Her sculptures were small, rarely more than a foot tall, figures of women in motion or repose, abstract studies of the human form that showed her dancers' understanding of how bodies move through space. She worked primarily in clay and bronze, creating pieces that referenced both classical sculpture and modernist abstraction. Critics who saw her work noted its technical competence but sometimes dismissed it as derivative, as the work of someone who understood form intellectually but lacked the emotional depth of truly great sculptors. But Lisa didn't seem to care about critical acclaim. She'd had enough of that during her modeling years. What mattered now was the work itself, the daily practice of making, the satisfaction of creating something with her hands that would exist independent of cameras or lighting or anyone else's vision. In interviews about her sculpture, the few she gave, Lisa was characteristically modest and precise. "Every line of the body is a sentence," she said. "Some are whispers, some are exclamations." She approached sculpture the way she'd approached modeling, as a problem in geometry and balance, as a search for the exact position where form and meaning aligned. Her studio was as disciplined as her ballet practice had been. She worked every morning from 8 until noon, then spent afternoons in Penn's studio, helping with his shoots or simply being present while he worked. It was a rhythm that sustained them both, mornings for her art, afternoons for their collaboration, evenings for the domestic life that grounded everything else. She also became interested in photography, wanting to understand the other side of the lens to see how images were made rather than just appearing in them. She studied under Penn, though by all accounts she was a reluctant student, more interested in the technical aspects of photography than the artistic possibilities. She would never be a great photographer. Her true talent was in being photographed. But the knowledge gave her new appreciation for the complexity of the work Penn did, the decisions involved in making a successful image. "Photography was never about me," she said in one of her final interviews. "It was about form, line, and grace." Were these years after modeling, the sculpture, the photography, the gradual retreat from public visibility, acts of choice? Or were they Lisa preparing for the inevitable moment when fashion would stop wanting her? By the 1960s, Lisa had essentially retired from modeling. She was in her 50s, and while Penn still photographed her occasionally, as a wife and muse rather than as a model, her commercial work had ended. But unlike most models who age out and struggle with the loss of relevance and income, Lisa transitioned smoothly because she'd always understood that modeling was temporary, that her real life existed beyond magazines and cameras, that she had other skills and interests to sustain her. She spent the 1960s, 70s, and 80s working in Penn's studio, not as a model, but as an assistant and collaborator, helping with lighting and composition, occasionally appearing in his personal projects, but mostly supporting his commercial work. She continued sculpting, creating pieces that were shown in small galleries and sold to private collectors. She took ballet classes well into her 70s, maintaining the flexibility and discipline that had defined her modeling career. She was, by all accounts, content, not seeking the spotlight she'd left behind, not nostalgic for her modeling years, simply living a life that felt authentic and chosen. Her relationship with fashion remained complicated. She'd helped create the industry that now existed, the supermodel phenomenon, the understanding that models could be celebrities, the idea that fashion photography was art. But she felt ambivalent about what it had become. "Elegance is a state of mind, not a dress," she told an interviewer in the 1980s, suggesting that fashion had lost something, had become too focused on surfaces rather than the discipline and thought beneath appearances. "I never thought of myself as beautiful," she said. "I was just a good tool for photographers." What hidden truths might still remain unspoken about Lisa's private life? Those who knew her suggest she was more complex than her elegant image suggested, capable of sharpness and criticism, sometimes difficult to work with, possessive of Penn's attention and time, uncomfortable with the aging process even while accepting it philosophically. She'd built her career on physical perfection, on bodies that held positions and wore clothes beautifully, and watching that body age, as all bodies do, required confronting the reality that her value to fashion had been temporary and contingent, dependent on qualities that couldn't last. But she also had a philosophical acceptance of time's passage that many former models lack. She'd never confused herself with her image, had always understood that Lisa the person and Lisa the model were related but separate entities. By separating her self-worth from her appearance, she'd protected herself from the devastation that destroys so many whose identities are built entirely on how they look. Penn photographed her throughout their marriage, thousands of images, many never published, documenting her aging with the same attention he'd brought to photographing her youth. These later photographs show Lisa as she was, still elegant, still carrying herself with a dancer's posture, but no longer trying to be the model she'd been in the 1940s. Her face shows age, her body shows time's passage, and Penn's photographs don't hide or minimize these changes. They document them with love and respect, suggesting that beauty exists at every age if you know how to see it. The fashion world's relationship with Lisa in her later years was respectful but distant. She was acknowledged as a pioneer, as the first supermodel, as someone who'd influenced everyone who came after her. But she wasn't invited to events or celebrations, wasn't used in retrospectives or campaigns celebrating fashion history. She'd been too early, too foundational. She was history rather than nostalgia, the ground rather than the building. And perhaps she preferred it that way, having no interest in being trotted out as a symbol of fashion's past when she'd long since moved beyond fashion into other aspects of living. Her death in 1992 at age 80 felt appropriately quiet, appropriately elegant. She died at home, in the apartment she'd shared with Penn for decades, in the city where she'd done her greatest work. There was no suffering, no dramatic decline, just the gradual wearing out of a body that had been used fully, that had stood for hours in studios and danced until her 70s and lived 8 decades of intentional, disciplined existence. Penn's response to her death was wordless. He didn't give interviews, didn't issue statements, didn't try to translate his grief into language. He simply continued working, using his photography as he'd always used it, as a way of seeing, of making sense of the world, of creating order from chaos. But those who knew him said something had shifted, that his photographs after Lisa's death carried a different quality, a shadow that hadn't been there before, as if acknowledging that the light he'd been chasing all those years had been Lisa herself. And now that she was gone, he was working in permanent twilight. The light went out, he told one close friend. I still work in the dark. The tributes that followed her death were reverent but brief. Vogue ran a retrospective of her covers. Harper's Bazaar published an essay about her influence on fashion photography. The New York Times obituary traced her career and acknowledged her significance. But these tributes felt inadequate somehow, unable to capture what Lisa had actually contributed, which wasn't just beautiful photographs, but a complete reimagining of what models could be, what fashion photography could achieve, what the relationship between photographer and subject could look like. Lisa had proved that models didn't have to be passive or interchangeable, that they could bring artistry and discipline to their work, that the best fashion photography resulted from collaboration between photographer and model, rather than the photographer simply using a model as a prop. She demonstrated that modeling could be a serious profession rather than just a stepping stone or a way to meet men, that you could take pride in the work even while understanding it was temporary. She wasn't the face of fashion, she was its backbone. In the years after her death, Lisa's significance has only grown. Fashion historians point to her as the first supermodel, the template from which everyone else followed. Photography scholars analyze the images Penn and others made of her, recognizing her contribution to the photographs themselves. Understanding that those images weren't just Penn's or Man Ray's or Horst's work, but collaborations where Lisa's intelligence and physical discipline were as important as the photographer's vision. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's 2009 exhibition, The Model is Muse, featured Lisa prominently, acknowledging her as the first model to be recognized as an artist in her own right, someone whose contribution to fashion photography was creative rather than just decorative. The exhibition displayed the range of her work, the balletic poses, the surrealist abstractions, the elegant simplicity, and visitors could see how she'd evolved over 3 decades, how her understanding of what modeling could be had deepened and matured. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Lisa came not from museums or magazines, but from the generations of models who followed her, who benefited from the standards she'd set and the respect she'd earned. They might not know her name. Fashion has a short memory, but they work in an industry she helped professionalize, earning salaries she made possible, receiving respect she fought for, approaching their work with seriousness she modeled. The models who did know Lisa's story understood their debt to her. When Cindy Crawford was asked in the 1990s about supermodel predecessors, she named Lisa first. She proved we weren't just clothes hangers. She showed that modeling required skill and intelligence, that we brought something to the photographs beyond just showing up pretty. Naomi Campbell, known for her own rigorous professionalism, cited Lisa's work ethic as inspiration. She understood that being on time, being prepared, being able to hold a pose, these weren't extras, they were the job. Even younger models, those who came of age in the 2000s when modeling had become reality TV and Instagram, could trace their professional standards back to Lisa's example. The photographers who worked with models trained in Lisa's tradition noticed the difference. They spoke of models who understood lighting instinctively, who could find their angles without being told, who approached each shoot as a collaboration rather than just showing up to be photographed. This was Lisa's legacy made concrete, a generation of models who understood that their bodies were instruments to be mastered, that fashion photography was a dance between photographer and subject, that professionalism and artistry weren't contradictions but complements. Her influence extended beyond modeling into broader conversations about beauty and aging, about women's value in industries that profit from youth, about the relationship between commercial work and art. Lisa had navigated all these tensions gracefully, retiring from modeling while still beautiful, transitioning to other creative work, maintaining her dignity and relevance even as fashion moved on without her. She'd proven that a woman's worth didn't end when her commercial viability ended, that there were ways to age in the public eye without either desperately clinging to youth or disappearing entirely. This lesson, perhaps more than her modeling work itself, became increasingly relevant as the models she'd influenced faced their own aging, their own questions about life after beauty. Lisa's archive, now housed at various institutions including the Museum of Modern Art, contains thousands of photographs, magazine covers and advertising campaigns, and Penn's personal work and images from photographers whose names have been forgotten. Looking through this archive is looking at the evolution of fashion photography itself, seeing how the industry moved from stiff formal portraits to dynamic modern images, and Lisa is there through all of it, adapting, evolving, always understanding instinctively what each photographer needed from her. There are also her sculptures, small bronzes and clay figures, studies of the human form that show her continuing fascination with bodies and movement even after she'd stopped using her own body professionally. These sculptures have been exhibited occasionally, valued more for their connection to her modeling career than for their artistic merit. But they reveal something important about Lisa, that she never stopped thinking about form and line and grace, that these concerns weren't just professional but fundamental to how she understood the world. In the end, what did Lisa Fonssagrives achieve? She proved that modeling could be an art form rather than just a job, that professional discipline could coexist with creative expression, that women could build entire careers from being photographed if they approached the work seriously enough. She demonstrated that beauty was less important than understanding of light and form and what cameras could capture, understanding of your own body and how to use it as an instrument, understanding of fashion and what designers were trying to communicate through their clothes. But she also proved something subtler, that you could be a muse and an artist simultaneously, that being looked at didn't preclude looking, that collaboration could be as creatively satisfying as solo work. Her relationship with Penn exemplified this. She was his muse but also his colleague, his subject but also his equal, someone who understood his vision well enough to help realize it, but who maintained her own identity and interests independent of his needs. The question of whether Lisa was artist or object, creator or created, troubled critics and scholars but never seemed to trouble Lisa herself. She understood that categories were less important than work, that the value of what she did lay in the photographs themselves rather than in how they were classified. and it seemed like false modesty until you understood that she meant it literally and proudly. That being a good tool required skill and knowledge and dedication, that there was artistry in understanding what was needed and providing it perfectly. Lisa Fonssagrives died in 1992, but somewhere between Gothenburg and Paris, between dance studios and photography studios, between being subject and being collaborator, a Swedish ballet student learned to translate physical discipline into visual form, learned that holding still could be as expressive as movement, learned that being photographed was not passive but active, not submission but collaboration. And fashion photography was never the same, because Lisa had shown what was possible when models brought intelligence and training to work that others approached casually, when elegance was achieved through discipline rather than just purchased with money, when form and grace were understood as skills to be mastered rather than attributes to be born with. Penn kept the photograph on his desk until his own final day, a reminder that the first light he ever mastered had also been the last he would lose. The image showed Lisa's face partially obscured by veil, mysterious, beautiful but also anonymous, capable of being anyone or representing anything. It was a photograph about form rather than personality, about light rather than emotion, about the collaboration between photographer and model that creates something neither could achieve alone. Lisa Fonssagrives taught the world that grace is not an accident of beauty but a decision of will. If discipline can become art, does perfection still need emotion? And when a muse learns to sculpt herself, does she stop inspiring or finally begin creating?